On this channel, we've talked about air supremacy in modern air warfare. It means having that degree of control where an opposing force is incapable of any effective interference with your air operations. We've also talked about how the US and NATO achieve air supremacy at a very high level. But what does all that look like at a lower level? That's the topic of this video, so let's dive in. A modern air force would do several things to get control of the air. Taking out enemy air defenses is one part of this. Attacking enemy fighters either in the air or at their home airfields is also a key part of air supremacy. That mission is known as offensive counter-air. But there's another mission known as defensive counter-air, or DCA, that's just as important. When we talk about DCA, we mean a defensive line of airborne guards protecting the rest of our forces. This could mean escorting high-value assets like tankers and AWACS, or being an umbrella over troops and civilians on the ground. It can even mean being a line of protection at a national border. Once you understand DCA, it's a lot easier to learn the other missions, like offensive counter-air, so that's what we'll focus on this video. DCA missions will be set up in what's called a Combat Air Patrol Station, or CAP for short. It'll be in orbit near a fixed point in the air where the CAP will hang out for a predetermined period of time. They can also be ground alert fighters that sit on an airfield waiting for a call to intercept a target. This alternative can save fuel, but it comes at the cost of response time. An airborne CAP will always respond faster than a ground alert fighter. For airborne DCA, a typical example of a CAP station would have it continuously manned by a flight of fighters in 3-hour shifts. So if you wanted a flight of 4 fighters to protect an area continuously, then you would need 8 separate 3-hour missions per day. Since aircraft need maintenance between flights and pilots have required downtime, you'll need to cycle through air crews for each flight. The U.S. Air Force requires a 12-hour crew rest between flight duty periods with a maximum of 12 hours in each flight duty period. So roughly 1 mission per day per air crew. This means you need 32 pilots and their planes at a minimum just to cover our example 4-ship CAP station full-time. But these numbers can change depending on the availability of fighters and the specific threat. Mission lengths could get longer if the Joint Force Commander needs to stretch out his forces. Or they might only fly the CAP during heightened levels of alert. The time period that a CAP flight is expected to be on station is known as the vulnerability window, or VUL for short. Keep in mind that this is the time on station. So the flight to and from the CAP station, as well as the mission planning and debriefing, is on top of this VUL window. In a small, low-threat area, you might only have a single DCA CAP station. But as the threat and area get bigger, so does the number of CAPs. So you might see an arrangement like this, where several CAP stations are protecting a broad front. Each flight will be responsible for its own area known as a lane. This arrangement also requires some coordination. So you can expect to see an additional asset attached to a grouping of lanes. This will either be in the form of an airborne controller in an AWACS aircraft, or a ground-based control and reporting center. You'll often hear CRC-based control referred to as a Ground Control Intercept, or GCI. In a very large setting, you could see multiple controllers, with each one controlling a group of lanes. Here's a real-world example of DCA CAP stations. This is from 1999 during Operation Allied Force, which was the NATO intervention in Kosovo. These red racetracks are CAP stations. You can see they're strategically placed around the combat areas in Kosovo and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. They're the defensive barrier between hostile territory and NATO tankers flying the yellow tracks. If any enemy fighters want to get at the tankers, they have to go through the wall of DCA fighters first. You might have noticed this CAP station down here, which seems oddly out of place. It's not a mistake, and it's actually a special type of CAP known as a goalie CAP. Just like a goalie in soccer, this flight is the last line of defense if something gets through the front line. The goalie CAP can also be used to backfill any frontline CAPs if they have to depart their station. Like if they have a mechanical failure or run out of munitions during a fight. If you look at how each CAP station's orbit is oriented, you'll see that they all have a leg pointed towards the threat region. This is intentional. If you're going to protect something, you need to constantly keep an eye on where potential threats can come from. To accomplish this goal, a flight in a CAP orbit can split into 2 groups. This way, a formation of 4 will have 2 flying on the outbound leg and 2 on the inbound leg at any point in time. This arrangement gives the flight constant radar coverage of the threat axis without slowly creeping forward into enemy airspace. Now you might be wondering, why would they worry about radar coverage if they have an AWACS or a CRC telling them where the enemy is? AWACS and ground-based radars are usually much more powerful than the systems installed in fighters, so you would expect them to have much better situational awareness. But this isn't always the case. In fact, we have historic precedent for this. In these 2 separate incidents, we saw fighter aircraft detect and track a hostile aircraft before the supporting AWACS could even see it. So it's important for fighters to be an active part of the detection process. This also affects the altitude that the cap will be flying at. As Robert Shaw put it in his book Fighter Combat, the most important factor in selecting the cap's altitude is usually the optimization of target detection. This is because it's easier for an aircraft's radar to detect targets above it when ground clutter is not mixed in with the radar returns. So flying above the expected threat's altitude could hurt the chances of detecting an air attack. Conversely, higher altitudes are more fuel efficient for jet engines. So a flight can stay on station longer if it stays high up. Both of these things will factor into a flight lead's plan for choosing a cap altitude. A common way to set up DCA is to put the flight into a racetrack orbit like this. The racetrack is aligned with the threat axis. That way, the air crews can maximize the amount of time they have radars pointed towards the threat on these straightaways. Whichever way the cap orbit is pointed, it will be based on a point in space. In the video explaining air tasking orders, we went over how a strike mission would receive their target in the form of a geographic coordinate. It would be the same for a DCA flight, only the target would be the location of the cap. A racetrack is like a standard holding pattern. This point, known as the fix, is where the turn to the outbound leg begins. A pilot could find that point using GPS, INS, or even as a TACAN fix. After making the turn, the flight would fly this straight leg and focus on operating the radar when facing the threat. In our Allied Force example, we saw straightaways that were 20 nautical miles in length. A simple way to keep to this distance is with time. Every 60 knots of speed equates to 1 mile per minute. So at 360 knots, you would cover 6 miles per minute, or 20 nautical miles in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. This is why fighters usually come equipped with a stopwatch or a digital equivalent. Now there is an additional challenge if you want to have 2 elements flying this orbit for continuous coverage. Those 2 elements will arrive together at the cap orbit as one formation, so how do they get in the correct position? It's actually really easy. On the way to the fix, the flight lead can turn the second element around at the halfway point of the orbit. So if we follow our earlier example with legs that are 3 minutes and 20 seconds long, then the second element would be split off at 1 minute and 40 seconds from the fix. But if you want to make it easier on yourself, you could also use even numbers, like 4-minute straight segments. From here, every time one of the elements reaches the fix, they let the other one know and both begin the turn to the opposite side. Using the earlier example, this should happen every 3 minutes and 20 seconds plus turn time. They would then repeat this until either the vulnerability window expires or the flight is sent out to intercept the target. So when does that intercept happen? A DCA cap is put in place to protect an asset. So a circle is set up around the defended asset, and anything entering that circle without authorization gets a visit from the cap. The radius of this circle depends on the threat. If an adversary has standoff weapons that can reach the defended asset from 20 miles away, then you would obviously want a circle that goes out beyond that. If it takes 3 minutes for your cap to reach that circle, then you would extend the circle by 3 minutes of flight time. Now let's say there's a standing order to try to contact the intruder via radio before shooting. Then you would extend it even further. When an unauthorized aircraft enters this circle, it's time for an intercept. This is called a commit, and there are several steps involved in doing a commit safely and effectively. The interceptors will need to coordinate with command and control throughout the intercept. From this video, we know the commander of all air operations is the JFAC, who can normally be found at the Air Operations Center. There's too much going on in a large-scale air operation for the JFAC to manage individual intercepts. So the authority to order a commit will be delegated down the chain. The next step down would be this tier, which contains all the CRCs and AWACS. But if needed, the authority to call a commit can be pushed all the way down to the fighters. This entire tree is known as the Theater Air Control System, and it's the chain of command used by every aircraft in the theater after they get airborne. After a commit is ordered, the interceptors need to arrive at the intercept in a position that gives them an offensive advantage. It's not as easy as it sounds. They also need to be ready to deal with an adversary that decides to fire on them before they get to the intercept. These topics will get their own videos. Once you understand the defensive counter-air patrol, it's easy to move on to other mission types. An escort mission is just like DCA, only with a moving defended asset. Close air support is also like DCA, only now your controller is attached to a frontline ground unit. A lot of the skills from DCA carry over to these other missions. These DCA topics and more will be the focus of the next few videos in this series. We'll go into greater detail on the baseline intercept used by the US Air Force. There's also a specific way that pilots and controllers talk to each other. We'll cover that too. So keep an eye out for those videos, and thanks for watching.